Hey guys, welcome to day 5. Today we're going to go ahead and try something new. Instead of me using a PowerPoint, I'm going to go ahead and write the notes on a line paper, like if you were writing your notes with me. So first of all, let's go ahead and get started. I hope that you are writing your notes on your notebook that I asked you to provide for yourself yesterday. And I only got 3 people send me their notes. So please make sure that you are sending me your notes because that is bonus points for you. Okay? And maybe during the week I might say, you know what, I'm just going to take it as a full grade. So you never know. So please make sure you're watching the videos first of all, and then that you're sending me the notes. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our name at the top. Always get into the habit of writing your complete name. Today's date is April the 3rd, I believe. Yes. We are on April 3rd, 2020. And today's lesson is we are on day 5 of online learning. We're going to do multiplying and dividing integers. Multiplying and dividing integers. So before we begin, let's get started with the tool that we use to help us remember what is the sign when you multiply and divide integers. Well, remember, we would always use the tic-tac-toe. And this is only for multiplication and division. I had some students yesterday in the work assignment that I gave for adding and subtracting. They wanted to use the tic-tac-toe. This is not for addition and subtraction. Don't forget that. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and start. Let's put all the positives. They go down the diagonal like this. And then everywhere else, we have our negatives. And just like I told you a while ago, this only works for multiplication and division, nothing else. Only multiplication and division. Okay, so if you take a look at it, here it tells us exactly what sign we're going to be getting back. So we have a positive times a negative. Positive times a negative is going to give you back a negative. And then you have a negative times a positive will give you back a negative. And then here you have a negative times a negative will give you back a positive. So let's go ahead and get started. Right now we just went over the rules for multiplication. It's that simple, right? So let's go ahead and get started with the first one. We're going to multiply integers. And before we do, there are different ways to represent multiplication. There are different what we call notations. Let's go ahead and write this down. So let's say, for example, the most famous one that we all know is the x. So you'll have a times b, the little x in the middle. You can also have a, the little dot b. These again are different notations. You can also have a parentheses b, or if you have a variable, which is a letter, and a number, you might just have them sitting next to each other like that without there being anything between them. But this is only for a variable, when there is a variable present, not when it's 2 numbers. Okay, so these are different notations that we have. So let's take a look at a few examples. Let's talk about when you have different signs. Well, we just talked about it on top. When you have different signs, obviously it's either going to be a positive times a negative. That's going to equal a negative. How do we know that? We look back at our tic-tac-toe. So for example, you might have 5 times negative 3. We know that it's a positive and negative. That's going to be negative 15. Okay? Or you might have a negative times a positive, and that will also equal a negative. And in this case, let's make 5 negative now. So now it's negative 5 times 3. What is that? Still negative 15. Okay? And also, when you have different signs, if you haven't noticed, the answer will always be a negative. So now let's talk about when you have the same sign. So this is a different signs. And actually, I forgot to write it, so I'm going to write it here on the side. This is for when I have different signs. Now let me go ahead and write when we have the same sign. Okay, well, when you have the same sign, you're either going to have two positives times another positive, which is going to be a positive, or you'll have a negative times a negative. If you look at your tic-tac-toe, negative times negative, right here in blue, is also a positive. So when you have the same sign, they're positive. Keep that in mind. We'll say, for example, 5 times 3. We know what 5 times 3 is. Count by 5s 3 times. That's just 15. Positive. Or you have negative 5 times negative 3. Same thing. A negative times a negative is just a positive. Therefore, that's also positive 15. That doesn't mean that those two expressions are the same. It just means that they give you the same product. This word that I just used, the word is product. The word product is the answer to a multiplication expression, or the solution. The answer to a multiplication expression. So when you hear someone say, well, the product to this is 20. Well, that's because they've multiplied two numbers to be able to get to 20. Okay. Now, we just talked about multiplying integers. Let's go ahead and I'm going to flip my page. You might not need to flip yours yet. Let's look at dividing integers now. Let's talk about this real quick. So obviously for this one, you can also use the tic-tac-toe. I'm going to go ahead and draw mine here. You can still use the tic-tac-toe. The rule still applies. Put your positives all the way down, and it stays exactly the same because the rules for multiplication and division are exactly the same. And then nothing else changes. It still is the same sign, just like multiplication. So you have positive divided by a negative is equal to a negative. Notice how they're different signs. And then you have a negative divided by a positive is also a negative. Again, different signs. But then when you have a negative divided by a negative, you end up with a positive. Now it's the same sign. And obviously, if you do a positive divided by a positive, then that will obviously also give you a positive. Before we move on, let's talk about some different notations that we use for division, just like we did for multiplication. So division also has different notations that you might see today. The most famous one is obviously the division symbol, so you'll have something like A divided by B, which could also be written as, or equivalent to, A over B. And then you can also write that in a division box. Remember, think about Nito. A inside, B outside. Okay, so these are just different notations that we use for division. So let's look at an example. And the first examples that we're going to look at is when we have the same, not the same, sorry, my apologies, when they have the different signs. So when we have different signs, let's take a look at the first problem. Let's take a look at one example. I can have 20 positive divided by negative 4, positive divided by a negative. We know that automatically that's going to be a negative. How do I know that? I look at my tic-tac-toe. It's going to be a negative. And I know that 20 divided by 4, if you think about it, you take 20 and you make 4 groups, each has 5 in it. So this is negative 5. I can also rewrite this as a fraction as 20 over negative 4, which is also negative 5, or in my division box as 20 inside, negative 4 on the outside, and this is also negative 5. Okay, now this is when they have different signs. Let's suppose at this time we make the 20 negative. So now, this is my second example. Let's make negative 20 divided by 4 is also negative 5. How do I know that? Because of my tic-tac-toe. It tells me a negative divided by a positive is also a negative. This can also be written as a fraction. If I put negative 20 over positive 4, this is also negative 5. Or you can use your division box. Negative 20 divided by positive 4, negative 5. So same thing. Different signs. If you haven't noticed a pattern by now, or the rule, when you are multiplying and dividing, every time you're dividing two integers that have different signs, you will always end up back with a negative. However, when you multiply or divide by integers that have the same sign, so let's look at, for example, let's make both the 20 and the 4 negatives now. It's example 3. Negative 20 divided by negative 4. If I look at my tic-tac-toe, a negative divided by a negative is a positive. Therefore, this is positive 5. And I put the little positive sign so that you don't get confused with my signs. So that is positive 5. Okay? Now, I can also write it like this. Negative 20 divided by negative 4 is still positive 5. Or, with our division box, negative 20 divided by negative 4 is also positive 5. So, it doesn't matter how you write it, a negative dividing by another negative is always going to be a positive. And obviously, if you're dividing a positive by a positive, it'll also be a positive. Okay? So, if you just realize, we just basically created a rule for multiplying and dividing integers. So let's go ahead and talk about the rule or the pattern that we just created. If you multiply or divide by a negative number, or no, sorry, not by a negative number, by different signs. So if you multiply or divide by different signs, the answer will be negative. Always. However, if you, why did I spell it so separately? If you multiply or divide by the same signs, the answer will be positive. And that will never change. Okay? But what about when you have multiple terms in an expression? And what do I mean by multiple terms? So let's take a look. Because you might have an example like this today in your exit ticket. You have multiple terms. So for example, you might have negative 5 times negative 4 times negative 2. Let's suppose. Multiple terms with negative numbers to be exact. Well, what is this going to be? If you think about it, I always tell you this. This is the advice that I would always give you in class. Do 2 at a time, right? So let's go ahead and take a look at first what negative 5 times negative 4 is. And if I do my little tic-tac-toe, because I might have forgotten what a negative times a negative is, or you might just have to remember, okay, same sign as positive. Same sign as positive. 2 negatives is a positive, so therefore this is 20, positive 20, times, don't forget this guy over here, negative 2. Different signs is negative. 20 times negative 2 is negative 40. I ended up with a negative number. Well, what if I added another negative number into that mix? So what if instead of having only 3 negative numbers, what if I had 4 negative numbers? So let's suppose that this time I had negative 5 times negative 4 times negative 2. Let's add another negative 3, just for fun. Remember, to add a time. So negative times a negative Same sign is positive, so this is positive 20, and we just did it at example 1, times negative 2 times negative 3. Bring these guys down, don't forget them. Now let's do 20 times negative 2. 20 times negative 2, positive times a negative, different signs is negative. This is negative 40 times negative 3. Same signs is positive. So, therefore, you're going to end up with a positive answer. Well, let me go ahead and multiply that out real quick. 3 times 0, 0. 3 times 4, 12. So this is positive 120. So if you notice in the example above, in example 1, it was a negative. And in the example below, it was a positive. And the reason for that is when you're multiplying numbers, when you're multiplying negative numbers and you have an odd amount of negative numbers like we did here, we had an odd number of negatives. What does that mean? Is that we had 3. 3 is a negative amount. Another odd number could be 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and so forth. Your product will always be negative. So when you have an odd number of negatives, your answer will equal to a negative. However, in the example 2, we didn't have an odd number of negatives. We actually had an even number of negative integers, So odd is the opposite of even. So in this case, we had an even number of negatives. Therefore, our answer is going to equal a positive. So in this case, we had 4, right? So you have 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. Any number that is even, any amount that is even. Okay, so you might have this included in your exit ticket today, so please be very careful. Now, this concludes our notes for today. And some of you might be asking, well, what now? What's next? So first of all, let me just go ahead and tell you real quick. Number 1, you should have already done your do now. So if you did that, press check. Number 2, the second thing you should have done was your video, which is this one right now. So as soon as you're done, you press check. Number 3, you need to go complete your assignment for today. This is due today at 11:59, so please make sure that you have that ready. Why do I always want to make my 9s into G's? So make sure that this is done. The next thing you should complete is your exit ticket, which is also due tonight at 11:59 p.m. And then the last thing you should be completing is your Khan Academy assignments that I have assigned you. These are also due today. I might have convinced myself to make the due date till Sunday. So if I did, please disregard the due today part. If you have a question on anything that we discussed today or on one of your assignments or your exit ticket or your Khan Academy assignments, please make sure to contact me or Mr. Rosas. Okay? Have an awesome day, guys. See you.